Tåsinge, Denmark, July 22, 1889. An elderly woman is out picking raspberries in a forest called Nordic, on a small island connected to the rest of the country by not much more than a ferry and a causeway. She sees two young people lying together on a kind of rain sheet, in a clearing. At first she assumes they are asleep. It's the kind of summer afternoon where that would make sense. They are not asleep. They've been dead for 3 days. The dead are a 34-year-old Swedish cavalry officer named Sixten Sparre and a 21-year-old circus performer who went by the stage name Elvira Madigan. There's an empty picnic basket beside them, an umbrella, and in Madigan's dress pocket, a folded piece of paper, a poem, written in a mixture of Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, and German, that she appears to have composed herself shortly before she died. Within months, this scene would be set to music. A ballad, written by a Swedish journalist, would be sung from barrel organs across the Nordic countries for decades. Within a century, it would become an Oscar-winning art house film, an entire piece of regional tourism infrastructure, and a wedding tradition. To this day, brides visiting the cemetery on Tåsinge are known to throw their bouquets onto this couple's shared grave. Here is the version everyone tells. Star-crossed lovers. A nobleman and a circus girl, separated by class, by his marriage, by an impossible situation, who chose death together rather than live apart. A real-life Romeo and Juliet. Here is the detail almost nobody mentions when they tell that version. Sparre shot Madigan first, through the right ear, with his service revolver. Then he waited. He didn't die with her. He died the next morning, by his own hand, in the same clearing, next to her body. That gap, between the shot fired at her and the shot fired at himself, sometime overnight, is where this episode lives. Because everything we think we know about this story was shaped by two things: a sensational 19th century press cycle that wanted a tragic romance, and a 20th century film industry that gave it to them. What actually happened, according to the documented record, the financial collapse, the desertion charge, the lies, the way Sparre's own family treated this afterward, tells a less poetic and more uncomfortable story. If you like true crime documentaries that go past the legend to look at what the record actually shows, this is Enter the Crime. Consider subscribing. But to understand how a circus performer from a family with no fixed nationality ended up in a Danish forest with a Swedish nobleman's service revolver, we have to go back to a freezing performance tent in Sweden, 18 months earlier. Let's get oriented. Tåsinge is a small island in the South Funen archipelago, in the strait between the Danish mainland and the larger island of Funen, part of the cluster of islands that makes up the Kingdom of Denmark. In 1889, it would have been a quiet, rural place, farmland, fishing villages, a handful of guest houses serving the nearby market town of Svendborg. Not the kind of place where anyone expected international scandal to arrive. That's part of why it did. The woman at the center of this story didn't really have a hometown. She was born Hedvig Antoinette Isabella Eleanor Jensen, in December 1867, in Flensburg, a town that, at the time, sat inside the Kingdom of Prussia, in the border region of Schleswig-Holstein, an area whose ownership had been disputed between Denmark and the German states for decades. Her parents were circus performers, unmarried at the time of her birth, touring through Germany and Denmark with a French circus company. It's commonly said today that Elvira Madigan was Danish. The honest answer is that nobody is fully certain what nationality, if any, she would have claimed for herself. She was, from birth, a child of the road, with a circus for a family and a string of stage names instead of a fixed identity. She grew up performing. By her teens, working under the name Elvira Madigan, borrowed from her mother's later partner, the American circus manager John Madigan, she'd become a genuine sensation. A slack-rope dancer who could juggle while balanced on the line, sometimes performing a unique double act with a foster sister, the two of them on separate ropes, one above the other, billed as Daughters of the Air. They performed across much of Europe: Berlin, Paris, London, Brussels, Moscow. In 1886, performing for the Danish royal family at Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen, she and her partner were each awarded a Gold Cross by King Christian IX. By any reasonable standard, this was a successful, hard-working, internationally touring entertainer, not, as the later legend would frame her, a passive ingenue waiting to be rescued by a nobleman. People who knew her at the time described her as shy and withdrawn off the rope, interested in poetry and literature, a capable amateur pianist. That's worth holding on to, because almost everything written about her afterward reduces her to a single function in someone else's story, the girl in the forest. She had a craft. She had an inner life that had nothing to do with Sixten Sparre. Sparre, for his part, came from a very different world, at least on paper. He was a Swedish nobleman, a lieutenant in a cavalry regiment, the Dragoons, a cavalry unit historically trained to fight both on horseback and on foot. He'd also worked as a journalist and wrote poetry. By 1889 he was 34, married since 1880 to a countess named Lutgard Adlercreutz, and the father of 2 young children. In January 1888, while reporting a story for a local newspaper, Sparre saw Madigan's circus perform in the Swedish town of Kristianstad. He became infatuated. The two began exchanging letters. Here's where the legend and the documented record start to diverge, right from the beginning. The legend says, 2 souls recognized something in each other across an impossible social gap. The record says, Madigan got tired of his letters. More than once, she tried to end the correspondence. Sparre wouldn't let her. According to a letter her mother later sent to the Danish newspaper Politiken, meaning this comes from the victim's own family, not from a sympathetic biographer, Sparre threatened to shoot himself if Madigan didn't do what he wanted. He also lied to her. About his marriage. About his finances. By this point Sparre had already squandered his fortune and was heavily in debt, facts he kept from the woman he was pressuring into a relationship. Madigan, according to the record, suffered what's described as a nervous breakdown under this pressure. And in May 1889, she gave in. She secretly left her family during a stop in Sundsvall, Sweden, without her own family even knowing about the correspondence that had led to this moment. That's the version of falling in love the documented record actually supports, not a mutual, fated romance, but a campaign of pressure, deception about his finances and his marriage, and a suicide threat, aimed at a young woman who had repeatedly tried to disengage. This is the moment everything starts moving toward the forest. I want to walk through this carefully, because the pacing of what happened in the final 7 weeks of these 2 people's lives tells you almost everything about who was actually in control of the situation, and it wasn't a mutual decision made by equals. Sparre had been granted 2 months military leave starting May 27th. He met Madigan in the Swedish town of Bollnäs. From there, they went to Stockholm, where Madigan's mother, having learned what was happening, attempted to intercept the couple by chasing them down on a steamboat. She failed. The 2 of them disappeared for a few weeks to an unknown location before resurfacing in Svendborg, on the Danish island of Funen, on June 18th. They checked into the city hotel and stayed there for nearly a month. And then the hotel did what hotels do, it presented them with a bill. Sparre couldn't pay it. By this point, he was, in the words of the documented record, completely broke, and had been living on credit for weeks. The couple fled the hotel rather than settle the debt. They moved to a guest house in Tåsinge, a small town on Tåsinge, where they lived for a few more days while what little money remained ran out entirely. Now pause on what Sparre's actual legal situation was during all of this. Taking Madigan and disappearing with her wasn't just a romantic scandal. Under Swedish military law, an officer overstaying or abandoning his post like this constituted desertion. If Sparre had returned to Sweden, he would have faced a court-martial, a military trial, and, given the severity with which European armies of this period treated desertion, he was looking at the realistic possibility of execution. He had also abandoned a wife and 2 young children, lied to the woman he'd pressured into running away with him about both his marriage and his finances, and was now penniless, hiding under what appeared to have been false identities, on a small foreign island, with a debt-driven exit from a hotel behind him and a military death sentence theoretically waiting if he went home. That is the actual situation on July 18, 1889, not 2 people in love with no way to be together, but one specific man, with no money, no legal way back to his old life, and an increasingly narrow set of options, accompanied by a woman he had lied to and pressured into this position from the very beginning. On the afternoon of July 18th, the two of them walked into Noreskov, the forest near where they were staying, with a picnic basket and an umbrella. What we know happened next comes largely from the physical evidence found 3 days later, not from any witness account, because there were no witnesses. Sparre drew his service revolver, standard military issue for a Swedish cavalry officer of this period, and shot Madigan in the head. He did not then immediately turn the gun on himself. The forensic record indicates he killed himself the following morning, July 19th, hours after killing her, not in the same moment. I'm going to sit on that detail, because it's the single most important fact in this entire case, and it's the one detail that the legend, the ballads, the films, and most of the tourist plaques manage to leave out or blur. A genuine mutual suicide pact, two people choosing, together, to die, does not typically look like one person killing the other and then waiting through an entire night before killing himself. What it can look like is something else, one person deciding, alone, that this is how the situation ends, and acting on that decision unilaterally, with the other person not necessarily having agreed to anything at all. We don't have Madigan's side of that final conversation. We never will. That silence is the actual mystery at the center of this case, not did they die, but did she choose this? There was no criminal investigation in the way you'd expect for a modern homicide, and that's itself worth examining, because the absence of one tells you something about how this case was framed from the very start. Reversal 1. By the time anyone found the bodies, both people involved were dead. There was no suspect to interview, no trial to hold, no jury to impanel. The only person who could have explained what happened in that clearing had killed himself rather than face the explanation. In a modern context, a case like this would likely be classified provisionally as a murder-suicide pending further investigation and treated with real institutional caution before anyone settled on a narrative. In 1889 Denmark, with a body found 4 days after death in a rural forest, that level of scrutiny essentially didn't happen. The case went straight from discovery to public narrative, with almost no investigative step in between. Reversal 2. That narrative arrived almost instantly, and it arrived from an unexpected direction. Not from the conservative press, but from critics of Danish and Swedish sexual morality and class structure. The conservative press, predictably, condemned the affair, Sparre's adultery, the scandal, the abandonment of his family. But the liberal press took a different angle, one that turned out to be far more durable. This was framed as a tragedy forced on the couple by rigid class society and a sexual morality that wouldn't allow a nobleman and a circus performer to be together. Major literary figures picked this up. The Danish author Holger Drachmann wrote a tribute poem. A Swedish journalist's ballad about the deaths, opening with a line "Sad things happen," became one of the most widely sung pieces of Nordic broadside balladry for the next several decades. Newspapers leaned hard into a comparison that had happened just 6 months earlier in Austria, the Mayerling incident, in which the Austrian crown prince and his mistress had died together in what was widely understood as a double suicide pact, similarly framed by class and forbidden love. Whether Sparre had actually been influenced by that earlier case is unclear. What's clear is that newspapers reached for that comparison almost immediately, because, as later researchers have put it bluntly, it was the version readers wanted. Love stronger than death, between a nobleman and a woman of humble birth. Here's what almost nobody asked. In the moment, why does a love stronger than death story end with the man waiting until the next morning to die? Reversal 3. And this is the one that really overturns the legend. More recent research, drawing on Sparre's financial records and behavior in his last years, paints an entirely different picture of who he actually was. In the years leading up to his death, he had lived, in the words of researchers who've examined this, extravagantly and self-destructively, squandering his fortune, taking on debt in a pattern serious enough that biographers have raised real questions about his mental state. One researcher, Claes Gronqvist, has suggested Sparre may have had bipolar disorder, and frames his pattern of extravagant waste, his rejection of his own family and the class values he'd been raised in, He had, by this point, positioned himself politically far to the left, a striking departure from his aristocratic background, and finally the relationship with Madigan itself, as symptoms of that underlying condition rather than as a grand romantic gesture. A different biographer, Kathinka Linda, is even less generous. Her assessment is that Sparre was simply spoiled, wasteful, and narcissistic. None of this is the same as a confirmed clinical diagnosis. Nobody examined Sparre while he was alive and able to be assessed, so any retrospective mental health framing here is informed speculation built from documented behavior, not a verified medical finding. But informed speculation built from documented behavior is a very different category of claim than tragic, fated, mutual love affair. And it's the version actually supported by what Sparre did with his money, his career, his family, and ultimately his service revolver. So here's the mid-episode question, and I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Given everything we've covered, the pressure campaign, the lies about his marriage and his finances, the desertion charge waiting for him in Sweden, the single shot to her head followed by a full night before his own, do you think this was a mutual decision two people made together? Or do you think one person made this decision and the other one didn't get a vote? Tell me in the comments, and hold that thought, because the answer the historical record seems to favor is closer to the second one, and it's not the version anyone built a film industry around. What happened to that question, in public memory, over the following century, is its own case. Let's talk about what this case became, because the gap between the event and its legacy is enormous, and I think it tells you something true about why certain true crime stories get romanticized while others don't. Sparre's mindset, to the extent the documented record lets us reconstruct it, looks like a man who had run out of every option his social position had ever given him. He deserted his post, with a court-martial and possible execution waiting if he returned. He'd abandoned a wife and 2 small children. He was penniless, hiding under assumed identities, in a country that wasn't his own, with a debt-fueled flight from a hotel behind him. And the relationship that supposedly justified all of this had been built, from the very start, on lies he told the other person and a suicide threat he used to keep her from leaving him. By the time they reached that forest, he had very little left to lose, and, based on what he did, appears to have decided that he wasn't willing to face whatever came next, for either of them. Madigan's position looks almost nothing like his. She was a working performer with an active, internationally successful career, who had repeatedly tried to end the correspondence that started this. She gave in only after sustained pressure and a threat of suicide from a man who had already lied to her about 2 of the most basic facts of his life, his marital status and his finances. Contemporaries described her as shy, literary, withdrawn, someone with an inner life that the legend has almost completely erased in favor of the circus girl who died for love. Here's the reframing I want to leave you with, because I think it changes how the whole story reads. The popular version of this case treats the forest as the site of a love so total it transcended death, a story about devotion. But look at what's actually documented. A man systematically lying to a woman, threatening his own death to control her decisions, financially and socially cornering himself until violence became, in his mind, the only exit, and then taking her with him, on his timeline, by his hand, with an entire night separating the 2 deaths. That's not a love story. That's the documented behavior pattern of coercive control escalating to lethal violence, dressed up afterward, by newspapers, by balladeers, by a tourist board, as romance, because romance was a much easier story to sell than coercion. And the institutions around this case, even at the time, seemed to have known the difference, on some level, even while the public romance was taking off. Sparre's own brother, Edvard, paid for the hotel bills, the funeral costs, and the tombstones. But here's the detail that I think says more than almost anything else in this entire case. The 2 original tombstones were made of different materials. Madigan's, white marble. Sparre's, dark gray granite. The deliberate difference, according to the historical record, was specifically meant to mark that the 2 of them were not, in the language used at the time, a genuine couple. Sit with that. The family paying for the burial went out of its way, in stone, permanently, to signal that whatever this was, it wasn't an equal partnership of two people who chose death together. And then, decades later, when the public narrative needed a new pair of matching gravestones for its anniversary, Madigan's marker was updated to include her stage name, folding her further into the legend the public wanted, even as the family's own original choice had pushed in the opposite direction. That tension, what the family signaled in granite versus what the public chose to sing about for the next 125 years, is, I think, the real story here. So what happened to that tension over the following century? That's the resolution. There was never a trial, a verdict, or a sentence in this case, for the obvious reason. The only person who could have been charged was dead by his own hand within roughly 12 hours of the killing. What followed instead was not a legal process but a cultural one, and it ran, almost uninterrupted, for over a century. The couple was buried together at Landit Cemetery on Tåsinge on July 27, 1889, in front of a large crowd of locals and summer visitors, itself a sign of how quickly this had become public spectacle rather than private tragedy. Madigan's own grandmother traveled to oversee the funeral but didn't arrive in time. The different stone tombstones we just discussed marked the graves until 1943, when cemetery reorganization moved them. New matching stones were installed for the 75th anniversary in 1964, with the original stones eventually restored and the site redesigned again as recently as 2013, 124 years after the deaths. The physical memorial to this case was still actively being reshaped for public consumption. The cultural afterlife moved even faster than the cemetery did. Within months, the ballad was already spreading across the Nordic countries, and it stayed in circulation for decades. In 1943, a Swedish film version was made, and, after pressure from Sparre's surviving relatives, the filmmakers changed his character's name, presumably because even the family didn't want their name permanently attached to the romanticized version of what he'd actually done. In 1967, Bo Widerberg's adaptation became the version most people now associate with this story, a Cannes Award-winning art film, scored throughout with a Mozart piano concerto that is, to this day, sometimes nicknamed the Elvira Madigan Concerto because of the film. A separate Danish film version was released the same year. A stage musical followed in 1990. A road on Tåsinge was named Elvira Madigan's Vej in 1970. Sparre, separately, has a street named after him outside the regiment he deserted. Here's the part of this story that I think matters most, looking back from where we're sitting now. For well over a century, the dominant version of this case was the one the conservative press, the liberal press, the balladeers, and eventually Hollywood-adjacent European cinema all agreed on, for completely different reasons, that this was a love story. A nobleman and a circus performer, kept apart by class, choosing death together rather than separation. It's a genuinely moving idea. It is also, on the documented record, the lies, the threats, the bankruptcy, the desertion charge, the single shot followed by an entire night, the deliberately mismatched tombstones, very likely not what actually happened. What more likely happened is that a man who had run out of every option his life had given him made a unilateral decision to end both of their lives, possibly while experiencing a serious untreated mental health crisis, and that the woman he made that decision for, a working circus performer with a career, a family, and a documented history of trying to extricate herself from this exact relationship, never got the chance to agree or disagree. Today, brides on Tåsinge still throw bouquets onto that shared grave. It's framed, in the island's own tourism literature, as a real-life Romeo and Juliet. I understand the appeal of that story. I'm not sure it's the one the evidence actually supports. The drop fell into the water, faded out slowly. The place where it fell, surrounded from wave to wave. Madigan wrote those lines herself, found folded in her dress pocket after she died. 137 years later, we still don't know if she chose to write her own ending, or if someone else had already decided to write it for her and left her just enough time, that last afternoon, to put something of her own down on paper before he did. If you're into true crime documentaries that separate the legend from the documented record, subscribe to Enter the Crime. And tell us in the comments what you think the evidence actually points to.